On the night of October 24th, 1942, the United States military calculated the odds of survival for a machine gun position on a remote ridge in Guadalcanal. They ran the numbers through their tactical tables. They consulted their field manuals. They did the math. One man, one gun, 3,000 enemy soldiers charging uphill in the dark. The math said it was impossible. The gun they'd given him was a 40-year-old relic that the experts called obsolete. The water-cooled Browning M 1917, a beast so heavy it needed 4 men just to move it. A weapon designed for trenches that didn't exist anymore, for a kind of war the world had left behind. But Sergeant John Basilone, a truck driver from New Jersey who barely finished high school, was about to prove every military expert in Washington, D.C. dead wrong. He was going to hold that trigger down until the water boiled away, until the barrel glowed red hot, until the steel itself began to melt in his hands. And when the sun rose the next morning, the bodies of the Emperor's finest division would be stacked 3 deep in front of his position, like cordwood, an impassable wall of the dead. The experts had written the manual, but John Basilone was about to rewrite history. This is a story about what happens when practical intelligence meets academic theory in the worst possible classroom, a jungle ridge in the South Pacific where the tuition is paid in blood. It's about the moment when a man who fixed trucks for a living looked at a weapon the college boys called a dinosaur and saw something they couldn't. He saw potential. He saw physics that would work in his favor if he was willing to pay the price. The price was going to be the skin on his hands. It was going to be second and third degree burns across his palms. It was going to be blisters that popped and filled with volcanic mud. But John Basilone understood something the experts writing those manuals in their clean offices never could. He understood that machines don't fight wars. Men do. And when you combine a man who refuses to quit with a machine that won't stop firing, you get something the enemy has never seen before. You get a weapon that breaks every rule in the book and wins anyway. Tonight you're going to hear the story they didn't teach in school, the story of Manila John Basilone and the night he turned a piece of obsolete junk into the hammer of God. You're going to learn about a weapon the military wanted to retire, about thermodynamics and ballistics and what happens when steel gets so hot it starts to glow in the dark. But more than that, you're going to see why the greatest generation earned that title. Because when the experts said something couldn't be done, men like John Basilone said, "Watch me." If you or someone in your family served in the Pacific during World War II, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where they were. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Let's honor their service together. And if you're here because you believe that American grit and determination can overcome any obstacle, that the man matters more than the machine, hit that subscribe button. Because we're going deep into the archives to find stories like this, stories about real Americans who refuse to accept impossible odds. Now let's go back to where it all started. To a small town in New Jersey during the Great Depression, to a kid who was about to learn the most important lesson of his life. John Basilone was born on November 4th, 1916 in the industrial town of Raritan, New Jersey. His parents were Italian immigrants. His father, Salvatore, worked as a tailor. His mother, Dora, died when John was young. This was the tail end of the Great Depression. Money wasn't just tight, it was non-existent. The Basilone family lived in a neighborhood where you learned to fix things because buying new wasn't an option. If your shoes wore out, you didn't go to the store. You learned to resolve them yourself. If the family car broke down and it broke down a lot, you didn't call a mechanic, you figured it out. John dropped out of school at 15, not because he was stupid, because he needed to work. He picked up odd jobs around town. He caddied at the local golf course. He learned to drive trucks. And somewhere in all that hands-on work, he developed something the college boys with their engineering degrees would never have. He developed an intuition for machinery. He could listen to an engine and tell you what was wrong before he ever popped the hood. He could feel when a tool wasn't balanced right. He understood that machines weren't just collections of parts. They were systems that wanted to work a certain way. And if you paid attention, if you respected the metal and the physics, the machine would tell you what it needed. Years later, in the darkness of a jungle halfway around the world, that intuition, that ability to feel what a machine needed would be the only thing standing between life and death for hundreds of Marines. His father wanted him to learn the tailoring trade, to have a respectable profession. But John wasn't built for sitting still and sewing buttons. He was restless. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to do something that mattered. In 1934, at 18 years old, he walked into an Army recruiting office and signed his name. The Army sent John Basilone to the Philippines. He was stationed at Fort McKinley in Manila, and it was there in the tropical heat, surrounded by other young men looking for adventure, that he started to build his reputation. He became a boxer in the regimental competitions, not because he loved fighting, but because it was honest. In the ring, there were no politics, no favoritism, just you and the other guy and whoever wanted it more. But it was his work with weapons that really set him apart. The Army had these Browning M 1917 water-cooled machine guns in the armory, heavy, complicated weapons that most soldiers treated like necessary evils. They were a pain to maintain in the humid Philippine climate. The water jackets would corrode, the condensation systems would clog, the intricate firing mechanisms would rust. Most of the guys on the weapons detail hated working on them. They'd oil them just enough to pass inspection and call it a day. John Basilone was different. He'd strip those guns down to individual parts and lay them out on a clean tarp. He'd study how each piece interacted with the others, the bolt, the firing pin, the feed mechanism, the water circulation system. There's a story from Manila that tells you everything you need to know about John Basilone. One day, the garrison's primary M1917 jammed during a training exercise. The whole mechanism locked up. The bolt wouldn't move. The feed wouldn't cycle. It was dead weight. The armory sergeant, a guy with 10 years of experience, spent 2 hours trying to fix it. He consulted the manual. He tried every procedure in the book. Nothing worked. He finally declared the gun a loss and started filling out paperwork to ship it back to the depot for professional repair. John Basilone asked if he could take a look. The sergeant laughed. "Kid, if I can't fix it, you sure as hell can't." But John didn't use the manual. He didn't follow the procedures. He closed his eyes and worked the action slowly, feeling where the resistance was. He could sense that the bolt was catching on something, not jammed by force. Caught by misalignment, he pulled one pin, shifted one component a fraction of an inch, reassembled the weapon. The gun fired perfectly. The sergeant asked him how he knew what to do. John shrugged. "I didn't think about it. I just felt where it wanted to go." That's the difference between someone who reads about machines and someone who understands them. John Basilone didn't read diagrams. He didn't memorize specifications. He felt how machines wanted to work. And that intuition, that mechanical empathy was going to save his life and the lives of hundreds of other men. The other soldiers started calling him Manila John. The nickname stuck. In 1937, after 3 years in the Army, John Basilone was honorably discharged. He went back to New Jersey and tried to settle into civilian life. He worked as a truck driver. He worked as a caddy again. He made decent money. But something was missing. On December 7th, 1941, John Basilone was 25 years old, working as a truck driver in Raritan, New Jersey. He was listening to a football game on the radio when the broadcast was interrupted. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. He could have stayed home. He'd already served his time. He had a steady job, good pay, no obligation to fight. But that restlessness came back, that feeling that he was built for something more than driving trucks on peaceful roads. He went to re-enlist. But here's the interesting part. He didn't go back to the Army. He went to the Marines. People asked him why. The Army would have taken him back in a heartbeat. They knew his record. They knew his skill with weapons. He could have walked into a comfortable position as an instructor at a stateside base. His answer was simple. "The Army taught me to follow orders. The Marines need men who can think." That wasn't arrogance. It was self-awareness. John Basilone knew he wasn't the kind of soldier who thrived in a rigid hierarchy. He was the kind of Marine who thrived in chaos. The Marines shipped him to Camp Pendleton for training, and that's where the weapons instructors discovered something special. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas, a grizzled veteran who'd served in World War I, watched John Basilone work a machine gun during a qualification course. Afterwards, he pulled him aside. "Basilone, I've been teaching men to shoot for 20 years. Most of them treat the gun like a tool, something you use and put away. You treat it like a teammate, like it's alive." John didn't know what to say to that. The sergeant continued, "I'm putting you down for heavy weapons specialist. Machine guns, you're wasted on a rifle." That assignment, that seemingly minor administrative decision, would change the course of the war in the Pacific. Now we need to understand the weapon itself, because if you don't understand why the experts hated it, you won't understand why John Basilone loved it. The Browning M 1917 water-cooled machine gun is one of the most beautiful pieces of machinery ever designed for killing human beings. It's also one of the most hated weapons in the history of the United States military. John Moses Browning designed it in 1917 for the trench warfare of World War I. The concept was brilliant. Create a machine gun that could fire indefinitely without overheating. The solution was the water jacket. The barrel of the gun was encased in a thick steel cylinder that held exactly 7 pints of water. As the gun fired, the friction of the bullets tearing down the barrel generated immense heat. That heat transferred into the water. The water turned to steam. The steam traveled through a rubber hose to a condensation can, where it cooled back into liquid water and was recycled back into the jacket. It was a closed-loop cooling system, a miniature industrial engine sitting on a tripod. In theory, as long as you had water and ammunition, the gun could fire forever. The rate of fire was 500 rounds per minute. The effective range was over 1,500 yards. The .30 caliber bullets it fired could punch through a brick wall at 400 yards. It was a masterpiece of thermodynamics, but here's the problem. It weighed 93 pounds when fully assembled. The gun itself was 41 pounds, the tripod was 52 pounds. Add in 7 pints of water, ammunition belts, and the condensation can, and you were looking at carrying over 120 pounds of equipment. Moving it required at least 2 men, usually 3. Setting it up took time. The tripod had to be leveled. The traversing and elevating mechanism had to be adjusted. The water had to be filled. The ammunition had to be positioned correctly. It was designed for static warfare, for sitting in a trench and firing at another trench 1,000 yards away, for wars that moved at the speed of artillery barrages and months-long stalemates. By 1942, the military academies and war college professors had declared the M1917 obsolete. The new war, the modern war, was about speed, tanks, airplanes, mobile infantry. The Germans had proven it in Poland and France with Blitzkrieg. The Japanese were proving it in the Pacific with rapid island hopping campaigns. A machine gun that needed a water tank and a condensation can was a relic. It was an anchor that tied infantry to a fixed position. The Army was transitioning to the M1919 air-cooled machine gun, lighter, faster to move, no water system to maintain. The barrel got hot, sure, but you could swap it out in 30 seconds and keep fighting. That was the future. The M1917 was the past. But here's what the experts didn't account for. Not everyone got the new equipment at the same time. The Marines were the second priority. The Army got the new guns first. The Marines in the Pacific got what was left over. And what was left over were warehouses full of M197s from World War I. When John Basilone shipped out to the Solomon Islands in September 1942, he was carrying a weapon that was older than he was. The Marines had a different name for the M1917. They called it the plumber's nightmare because that's what it looked like, a bunch of pipes and hoses cobbled together. The water jacket looked like industrial plumbing. The rubber hoses looked like they belonged in a factory. The whole contraption looked like someone had ripped it out of a basement and bolted it to a gun. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, the weapon's design flaws became painfully obvious. The hoses snagged on vines and roots. The heavy tripod sank into the soft volcanic soil like a stone in a pond. The condensation can got knocked over in the chaos of combat. The water jackets corroded in the humidity, and most importantly, the weight made it almost impossible to move during a firefight. Most sergeants hated being assigned to heavy weapons sections. It was a miserable job with a miserable piece of equipment. John Basilone volunteered for it. When other Marines complained about the weight, John saw stability. A 90-pound gun with a 50-pound tripod doesn't move when you're firing. It stays exactly where you put it. No walking, no climbing, no drift. When they complained about the water system, John saw unlimited sustained fire. Air-cooled guns had to pause. They had to let the barrel cool or risk a catastrophic failure. The M1917 never had to stop. When they complained about the setup time, John saw precision. The traversing and elevating mechanism let you dial in exact fields of fire. You could sweep a specific arc with mathematical accuracy. He understood something the manual writers didn't. This gun wasn't designed for mobility. It was designed for stopping power, for creating an impenetrable wall of lead that nothing could cross. And if you knew where the enemy was going to attack, if you could predict the direction and dig in beforehand, this dinosaur became a fortress. In August 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, a malaria-infested jungle island in the Solomon chain that most Americans had never heard of. The strategic objective was simple. Seize Henderson Field, the airstrip the Japanese were building. Control that airstrip, and you control the supply routes to Australia. Lose it, and Japan cuts off the entire Southwest Pacific. The Marines took the airstrip in the initial assault, but then the Navy, spooked by Japanese air attacks, pulled the fleet back. They left the Marines alone on that island with limited ammunition, limited food, and no way to evacuate. The Japanese weren't going to let them keep it. Throughout September and October, they poured reinforcements onto the island. The Imperial Army's Sendai Division, 3,000 battle-hardened veterans who'd fought in China, the Emperor's Hammer. Their mission was simple: take back Henderson Field, kill every Marine on the island. The Marines dug in along a perimeter they called the Ridge, a series of muddy, disease-infested positions carved out of the jungle. They were starving. They were sick. Half of them were shaking with malaria. Their feet were rotting from jungle rot, a fungal infection that turned skin into weeping, bloody hamburger meat. But they had one advantage. They knew where the Japanese were going to attack. The terrain funneled any assault toward specific positions along the ridge. If the Marines could hold those positions, they could hold the airfield. Let me paint you a picture of what it was like on that ridge in October 1942. The rain fell constantly, not gentle rain, violent tropical downpours that turned the ground into a slick volcanic mud that got into everything. Your weapon, your food, your wounds. The Marines were down to one meal a day. captured Japanese rice mixed with whatever they could scrounge. Half the bags had worms in them. You ate it anyway. At night, you could hear your buddy's teeth chattering from malaria chills. The sound carried over the rain, a rattling, desperate sound that told you the disease was eating them alive from the inside. You couldn't sleep, partly because of the mosquitoes, partly because of the jungle noises, branches cracking animals, screaming sounds that might be enemy infiltrators or might be wild pigs. But mostly you couldn't sleep because you knew they were coming, the Japanese 2nd Division, thousands of them, moving through the jungle in the dark. And when they came, they weren't going to stop. They weren't going to take cover or retreat. They were going to run straight at you, screaming bayonets fixed, willing to die if it meant they could get close enough to use their blades. The Japanese had a word for it. Bonsai, a charge that combined spiritual fervor with tactical brutality. The philosophy was simple. The warrior spirit can overcome superior firepower. If you're willing to accept death to embrace it, you can break any defensive line. The tactic was to throw so many men at a position that the defenders couldn't kill them all. The first wave would absorb the bullets. The second wave would get closer. The third wave would reach the trenches. It was a human tsunami. And against rifle companies with limited ammunition, it often worked. But against a properly positioned machine gun with a soldier who understood how to use it, that was a different equation. John Basilone arrived on Guadalcanal in September as a sergeant in charge of 2 machine gun sections. He'd been promoted based on his expertise with heavy weapons. He was assigned to a stretch of the ridge where intelligence suggested the Japanese would concentrate their assault. 2 M1917 positions separated by about 30 yards of dense jungle. If both guns failed, the entire line would collapse. For 3 days before the October 24th attack, John Basilone did something that other sergeants thought was crazy. He became obsessed with his weapons, maniacally obsessed. He stripped them down completely, every bolt, every spring, every pin, and cleaned them in the dark with a toothbrush. He oiled every moving surface until the metal gleamed. He tested the water flow through the jackets a dozen times. He positioned and repositioned the tripods to get the exact angles he wanted. Other Marines asked him why he was bothering. The guns worked fine. They'd passed inspection. His answer was simple. Inspection standards are for peacetime. War standards are different. He knew something the others didn't. He knew that Guadalcanal's volcanic mud was like grinding paste. 1 grain of sand in the wrong place and the gun would jam. And if the gun jammed during a bonsai charge, the 30-yard gap between his 2 positions would become a highway for 3,000 screaming enemy soldiers. So he prepared, he cleaned, he tested, he memorized every inch of those weapons until he could operate them blindfolded. He was preparing for a night when the manual wouldn't matter, when all the expert opinions and tactical doctrine would evaporate in the face of reality. He was preparing to survive. October 24th, 1942. The afternoon before the attack. John Basilone positioned his 2 gun teams along the ridge. The primary position was a muddy hole about 3 feet deep, just large enough for the gun and 2 men. The secondary position was 30 yards to the right, covering a gap in the jungle where the vegetation thinned out. He set up interlocking fields of fire. If the enemy gets past one gun, the other gun can shoot them from the side. No matter which direction they attacked from, they'd be walking into a crossfire. The tripods were dug deep into the mud, as deep as the volcanic soil would allow. Not ideal, but it would have to do. The water jackets were filled to the 7-pint mark exactly. The ammunition belts were laid out on canvas to keep them out of the mud. The condensation cans were positioned carefully so they wouldn't tip over. Everything was ready. Textbook perfect. His primary gun crew consisted of 3 Marines. Private First Class Robert Powell was the loader, 19 years old, farm kid from Iowa. This was his first real combat. He'd been on the island for 3 weeks and already looked like he'd aged 10 years. The malaria had him bad. His hands shook even when he wasn't scared. During the setup, Powell pulled a small photograph from his pocket. It showed a white farmhouse with a red barn in the background, a woman and a man standing in front, cornfields stretching to the horizon. "That's home," Powell said quietly. "Cedar Rapids, my folks' place. Gonna go back there when this is over, work the farm, maybe get married." Basilone looked at the photo. "Looks like good land. Best in Iowa." Powell tucked the photo back into his shirt pocket close to his heart. "You got a place like that, Sarge? Somewhere you're going back to Basilone?" Thought about Raritan, about his father's tailor shop, about streets he'd walked 1,000 times. "Yeah," he said, "I got a place, but right now this ridge is our place, and we're going to make sure we all get to go home." Corporal James Mitchell was the spotter, experienced, calm under pressure. He'd been in the first wave at Guadalcanal and had seen enough combat to know when to talk and when to shut up. Private Nash was the ammo carrier, nervous talker, couldn't stop running his mouth. Some guys dealt with fear by going quiet. Nash dealt with it by narrating every thought in his head. The secondary gun position was manned by Marines who'd barely finished boot camp. Good kids. but inexperienced. If things went wrong, they'd panic. John Basiloni knew his primary position would carry the weight. He was okay with that. As the sun started to set, Basiloni sat in the mud next to his gun. He ran his hand over the water jacket. The steel was cool and smooth. The weapon was ready. He thought about Raritan, about his father's tailor shop, about the simple life he could have had if he'd stayed home and learned to sew buttons onto suits. He thought about Manila, about the boxing matches and the other soldiers who'd taught him that fighting wasn't about size or strength. It was about refusing to quit, about lasting one more round than the other guy thought you could. He looked at Private Powell, who was staring into the jungle with wide, terrified eyes. Basiloni winked at him. "Kid, tonight you're going to learn why they pay us extra." Powell tried to smile. Failed. "Sergeant, what do we do if they break through?" "They won't. But if they do, they won't because we won't let them." Simple as that. Mitchell, checking the ammunition belts one more time, spoke up without looking at Basiloni. "He's asking the right question, Sarge. What's the fallback plan?" Basiloni looked at his spotter. Mitchell's hands were steady as he worked, but Basiloni could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched. Mitchell had seen combat before. He knew what was coming. "The fallback plan," Basiloni said, "is we don't fall back. We hold this position, period." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Then I guess we better make sure this gun doesn't jam. That's why we spent 3 days cleaning it," Basiloni said. "Tonight this weapon is going to work perfectly because we're not going to give it any other choice." As darkness fell, the jungle came alive with sounds, branches cracking, whispers in Japanese, movement that might have been men or might have been wild animals. The rain started again, a steady drumming that turned the ground into soup and made it impossible to see more than 20 feet. Up and down the line, Marines checked their weapons for the 100th time, fixed bayonets, whispered prayers. John Basiloni checked his gun one last time. The bolt moved smoothly. The belt fed clean. The water sloshed in the jacket. He wrapped his hands around the butterfly trigger grips. The metal was cold and wet. He practiced the motion. Thumbs down, squeeze, traverse left to right. Smooth, mechanical, no thought required. The experts in Washington had written a manual for this weapon. They'd calculated the optimal rate of fire. They'd determined the proper intervals between bursts. They'd created a doctrine that assumed the enemy would follow certain rules. But John Basiloni had seen the intelligence reports. He'd talked to the Marines who'd survived the earlier banzai charges. He knew the Japanese didn't follow American rules. They were going to run. They were going to sprint full speed into the teeth of American firepower. They were going to sacrifice the front ranks so the back ranks could close the distance. Against that kind of attack firing in 6-round bursts was suicide. The manual would get them killed. So Basiloni made a decision. When the attack came, he was going to ignore every rule in that manual. He was going to hold the trigger down and keep it there until the belt was empty or the gun melted into a pile of useless slag. The experts said that was impossible. The gun would overheat. The barrel would warp. The weapon would fail. John Basiloni didn't care what the experts said. The experts weren't sitting in a muddy hole with 3,000 screaming soldiers about to come out of the darkness. He was. At 9 o'clock, the wind shifted. It was a small thing, the kind of detail you might not notice if you weren't paying attention. But John Basiloni noticed. The breeze that had been blowing from the American lines toward the jungle reversed. Now it was blowing from the jungle toward the Marines, and it carried a smell. Chili powder, sweat, rice. The Japanese soldiers had eaten a final meal before the attack, a traditional pre-battle ritual, spicy rice to warm their bodies and steel their spirits for the charge. That smell, that mixture of spices and perspiration, was the smell of 3,000 men preparing to die. At first it was just a murmur, a low rumble like distant thunder. Then it grew, voices chanting in unison, thousands of throats shouting the same word over and over, banzai, banzai, banzai. It wasn't just sound, it was pressure. It was a physical force that bypassed your logical brain and went straight to your animal stem. It was the sound of inevitable death rushing toward you. A flare popped overhead. The green phosphorescent light bathed the ridge in a sickly glow, and there they were. The jungle floor was moving. The carpet of vegetation was rolling uphill like a living thing, except it wasn't vegetation. It was men. Hundreds of men. Thousands of men. They were shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, screaming, running at full sprint straight up the hill toward the American positions. No tactics, no cover, no fire and maneuver, just a human wave that didn't care about bullets because bullets only killed individuals, and there were so many individuals that the math didn't matter anymore. John Basiloni looked at that wave. He looked at his gun. He thought about the manual sitting in some warehouse back in the States. The manual said fire in controlled 6-round bursts. Pause between bursts to check your sights and monitor your water temperature. Conserve ammunition. Maintain fire discipline. The manual was written by men who assumed the enemy would behave rationally, that they'd take cover when fired upon, that they'd retreat when their casualties became unsustainable. The manual assumed a civilized war. But the men running up that hill, bayonets glinting in the flare light faces, twisted in fury and religious ecstasy, they weren't interested in being civilized. John Basilone racked the charging handle of the M1917. The heavy bolt slammed forward with a sound like a metal door slamming shut. He wrapped his fingers around the butterfly trigger grips. He sighted down the barrel at the mass of humanity surging toward him, and he made his decision. The manual was written by men who never faced a human tsunami. The manual assumed limits that didn't exist in this jungle. The manual was about to become irrelevant. Tonight, John Basilone wasn't going to fire in bursts. He wasn't going to pause. He wasn't going to conserve anything. He was going to hold that trigger down until the water boiled away and the barrel glowed red and the steel itself began to fail. He was going to turn this obsolete piece of junk into a wall of lead that physics said shouldn't exist but would exist anyway because he willed it into being. He squeezed the trigger, the gun roared to life, and the battle for Henderson Field began. The plumber's nightmare came alive in John Basilone's hands with a violence that shook his entire upper body. The recoil traveled up through his arms and into his shoulders like a continuous earthquake. The butterfly trigger grips vibrated against his palms. The heavy water-cooled gun didn't just make noise, it created pressure, a physical wall of sound that hit you in the chest. 500 rounds per minute, that's what the manual said. But when you're holding the trigger down when the belt is feeding continuously, 500 rounds per minute stops being a number and becomes a blur. The ammunition belt that usually fed into the receiver with a rhythmic click-clack turned into a stream of brass and canvas. You couldn't see individual rounds anymore, just a golden ribbon disappearing into the gun and reappearing as empty casings that sprayed out the side in an arc of hot metal. The impact of the 30 caliber bullets on the charging mass was immediate and gruesome. At 50 yards, a 30 caliber round carries enough kinetic energy to lift a grown man off his feet. The copper-jacketed slugs didn't just penetrate, they transferred their momentum into flesh and bone with catastrophic effect. Men didn't fall, they were thrown backward, their bodies jerking like puppets with cut strings. But for every man that went down, 2 more stepped over the body. They were climbing over the dead to get to the living. The human wave didn't slow, it didn't hesitate, it just kept coming, absorbing the bullets like a sponge absorbs water. The M1917 was doing exactly what John Browning had designed it to do back in 1917, but it was doing it at a pace that was terrifying to watch. The water inside the heavy steel jacket around the barrel began to boil within the first minute of sustained fire. The physics were brutal and simple. Every bullet that tore down that barrel generated friction. Friction created heat. Heat transferred into the 7 pints of water surrounding the barrel. The water temperature climbed from 70 degrees to 180 degrees in less than 60 seconds. At 212 degrees, Fahrenheit water boils. The steam pressure built inside the jacket, forcing its way out through the relief valve with an angry hiss. The rubber hose that connected the jacket to the condensation can started to shake as superheated steam rushed through it. In the condensation can, a simple but elegant process was supposed to happen. The steam would cool, turn back into liquid water, and gravity would feed it back into the jacket, a closed loop. Perpetual cooling, that's what the engineers had promised. But the engineers had tested their weapon in controlled conditions. On flat ranges with measured distances, they hadn't tested it in a jungle where the ambient temperature was 90 degrees and the humidity was so thick you could see it. They hadn't tested it during a downpour that turned everything into a steam bath. A plume of white steam rose from Basilone's gun pit, mixing with the rain and the cordite smoke from the burning gunpowder. To the Japanese soldiers charging uphill, it was a beacon. They could see exactly where the death was coming from. They focused everything they had on that position. Grenades started landing in the mud around the gun thrown by soldiers in the second and third waves. They exploded with wet thumps, throwing geysers of black volcanic sludge into the air. Bullets pinged off the water jacket with sounds like a hammer hitting an anvil. The air around Basilone became a crosshatch of tracers and shrapnel. He ignored all of it. His entire world had narrowed to the gun and the belt and the mass of humanity rushing toward him. But the mud was betraying him. This was the enemy the experts had never accounted for, not the Japanese, Guadalcanal itself. As the ammunition belt whipped out of the canvas box, it had to cross 3 feet of open ground before entering the receiver. In that 3-foot gap, the belt dragged across wet volcanic soil. And that soil wasn't just mud, it was an abrasive paste made of pulverized rock and decayed vegetation, gritty, sticky, corrosive. Every time the belt moved, it picked up microscopic particles of that grit. Those particles rode the belt right into the receiver, into the delicate machined steel guts of the weapon. Once inside, they acted like grinding compound, metal on grit. The smooth hydraulic rhythm of the gun started to change. The steady chug, chug, chug turned turned into something more jagged, a coughing, stuttering rhythm that any machine gunner recognizes instantly. It's the sound of a jam waiting to happen. Basiloni screamed at Private Powell over the roar of the gun. "Keep the belt high, get it out of the mud." But Powell was busy trying to keep his head attached to his shoulders. Bullets were cracking past his ears. A grenade had landed 2 feet from his position and covered him in filth. His hands were shaking so badly from fear and malaria that he could barely hold the belt steady. The gun on Basiloni's right flank went silent. Not a gradual slowdown, just instant total silence, the kind of silence that screams danger to every Marine on the line. 30 yards to the right, the inexperienced crew had run into the inevitable problem. The sand and grit from the Guadalcanal mud had worked its way into the locking lugs of the bolt. The mechanism that was supposed to slide smoothly back and forth was frozen solid. The gun was jammed, and the Japanese heard it. You don't need a radio or a tactical officer to tell you when a gun stops firing. Every soldier in that charging mass knew instantly that a 30-yard gap had just opened in the American defensive line. They flowed toward it like water finding the path of least resistance. They poured into that gap, screaming, sensing weakness. If they got through, they would flank Basilone's position from the side. They would roll up the entire line from behind, like peeling back a carpet. The defense would collapse. Basilone saw the breach developing. He saw Japanese soldiers sprinting through the darkness, bypassing his field of fire. He tried to traverse his gun to the right to catch them, but the geometry was wrong. The tripod was dug too deep into the mud. The gun could only swing so far before the legs caught in the soft ground. The manual said this was the moment to fall back, disable the weapon, retreat to a secondary position, regroup. A machine gunner without a field of fire is a dead man. The doctrine was clear. John Basilone decided to rewrite the doctrine. He grabbed the scorching hot carrying handle of the M1917 and yanked it up off the tripod mount. The gun weighed 41 pounds. The water jacket added another 15 pounds of water and steam. It wasn't designed to be carried while firing. It wasn't designed to be fired from anywhere except a stable mount. But Basilone didn't have time to consult the engineering specifications. He lifted the gun, the steam hose dangling like a severed artery, condensation can banging against his leg, and he ran. He splashed through knee-deep mud, moving toward the silent gun position on his right. He wasn't running away from the enemy. He was running parallel to them, exposing his entire body to incoming fire to get to the breakdown. Bullets kicked up spray around his boots. A grenade exploded behind him, the concussion shoving him forward. He slid into the silent pit like a baseball player stealing home, crashing into the mud next to the terrified crew who were frantically trying to clear the jam with shaking hands. He didn't bother with their gun. There was no time. He slammed his own M1917 onto the edge of the foxhole, using the mud bank itself as a mount. No tripod. No traversing mechanism, no elevation adjustment, just raw earth and determination. He pulled the trigger. The gun roared back to life, spitting flame into the flank of the Japanese charge. The recoil was brutal. Without the heavy tripod to absorb and distribute the shock, every ounce of that recoil drove straight into Basilone's body. The stock, or what passed for a stock on the M1917, hammered into his shoulder with bruising force. His arms had to fight the muzzle climb, forcing the barrel down to keep the bullets at waist height instead of climbing up into the trees. He had become the mount, a human tripod. His body was absorbing the violence of 500 explosions per minute so that the bullets would go where they needed to go. The Japanese soldiers who had rushed into the gap, expecting a clear path to the American rear, were caught in the open. The stream of fire that appeared from an unexpected angle cut through them like a scythe through wheat. Bodies spun and fell. The charge broke apart, men diving for cover that didn't exist. Basilone swept the gun back and forth, hosing the area with controlled rage. The steam from the water jacket was hissing right next to his ear, hot and loud enough to hurt. The barrel was getting hotter. The water was boiling off faster now because the steam hose had been disconnected when he ripped the gun off the tripod. The closed loop system was broken. The steam had nowhere to go except out into the wet jungle air. The metal of the water jacket, which was supposed to stay cool enough to touch, began to radiate heat like a wood stove. Basilone could feel it through his shirt, a searing warmth that was rapidly becoming painful. His left arm, wrapped around the jacket to hold the gun steady, was getting the worst of it. The heat was baking the skin on his forearm through the wet fabric. It hurt, but it was a distant problem. The immediate problem was the 1,000 men trying to kill him. The belt snapped empty. The tail end whipped into the receiver. The gun went silent. Basilone screamed for another belt. The loader in the jammed gun pit looked at him with wide, panicked eyes. He shook his head. We're dry. They had used all their ammunition before the jam. Basilone's own supply was back at his original position, 40 yards away through a gauntlet of enemy soldiers. Most men would have stayed in that hole, would have drawn their pistol and waited for the inevitable. would have hoped that reinforcements would arrive before the Japanese swarmed the position. John Basilone looked at the jungle between him and his ammunition. He looked at his Colt .45 pistol, and he made a choice that bordered on insanity. He drew the pistol. It looked tiny and inadequate compared to the machine gun. A toy. He grabbed his machete with his other hand. He told the Marines in the hole to fix the jammed gun or die trying. Then he climbed out of the foxhole and ran into the darkness. He was heading back to get ammunition through enemy territory. In the middle of a battle, the jungle was crawling with Japanese infiltrators who'd slipped through the line. They were everywhere, in the trees, behind logs, waiting in the tall grass. Basilone didn't try to be quiet. He didn't try to sneak. He charged straight through, trusting speed and aggression to keep him alive. He ran into a group of Japanese soldiers setting up a mortar tube 50 yards behind the American lines. They looked up at him in surprise. He didn't slow down. He fired the .45 pistol at point-blank range. The heavy slugs, twice the diameter of rifle rounds, had stopping power that bordered on supernatural. Men went down like their strings had been cut. When the pistol's 7-round magazine ran dry with a metallic click, Basilone didn't stop to reload. He swung the machete. What happened next wasn't clean. It wasn't heroic. It was ugly, desperate, close-quarters butchery. The machete was a tool designed for clearing jungle vegetation. It worked just as well on human flesh and bone. Basilone carved a path through the shadows, driven by a singular frantic need. The gun needed to eat, and he was the only one who could feed it. He reached the supply dump in the rear. His chest was heaving. His uniform was torn and covered in mud and blood. The supply clerk's Marines, who'd been assigned to relatively safe jobs because they weren't considered combat material, stared at him like he was a ghost, risen from a grave. Basilone didn't ask permission. He didn't explain. He grabbed 2 ammunition boxes. Each box contained a belt of 250 rounds. Each box weighed 40 pounds. He slung them over his shoulders like saddlebags. 80 pounds of lead and brass added to his own body weight. Then he turned around and ran back the way he came, back through the kill zone, back through the area crawling with enemy soldiers, back toward the firing line that was crumbling by the second. Japanese soldiers heard him coming. They tried to set up an ambush at a choke point where the trail narrowed between 2 fallen logs. Basilone saw the trap. He didn't try to go around it. He ran straight through it, firing his reloaded pistol one-handed while carrying the ammunition boxes. The audacity of it, the sheer aggressive insanity, caught the Japanese off guard. By the time they reacted, he was past them. He dove back into the gun pit. The Marines looked at him with something resembling religious awe. He wasn't just their sergeant anymore. He was proof that the impossible was possible if you wanted it badly enough. Basilone slammed a fresh belt into the M1917, racked the bolt. The gun roared back to life. But something was different now. Something was wrong. The water in the jacket was gone. The cooling system had completely failed. All the steam had escaped through the disconnected hose during the mad dash back to the original position. Without water, the manual said the gun would fail in 2 minutes. The barrel would overheat. The steel would warp. The weapon would destroy itself. Basilone clamped his hand onto the grip. He wrapped his other hand, protected only by a torn piece of wet cloth, around the scorching metal of the barrel jacket. He ignored the physics. He ignored the metallurgy. He ignored every warning the engineers had ever written. He held the trigger down. The gun began to sing a different song. It wasn't the rhythmic, mechanical sound of a well-oiled machine anymore. It was a high-pitched, metallic scream, the sound of steel under stress, the sound of metal being pushed past its design limits. The barrel was expanding from the heat. The grease that lubricated the internal parts was cooking off, creating clouds of acrid smoke that stung his eyes and throat. The barrel began to change color, from a dull gunmetal gray to a faint reddish glow, like a coal in a campfire just starting to catch. The heat radiating from the weapon was incredible. It traveled through the receiver group, through the steel handles, heating everything it touched. The grips became hot enough to blister skin on contact. Basilone's hands were burning. The pain was sharp and immediate. The smell of singed hair mixed with the cordite smoke, the smell of cooking flesh joined it, but he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. If he stopped firing to let the gun cool, the Japanese would be in his hole in 10 seconds. He had to make a trade, the skin on his hands and the life of the gun for the lives of his men. He squeezed harder. The barrel turned brighter red. The glow was visible now, even in the darkness. The Japanese could see it, a beacon, a challenge. They charged toward it, throwing themselves at the source of their destruction. Basilone traversed the weapon, slowly sweeping the fire across the charging line. Raindrops hit the glowing barrel and evaporated instantly with tiny hisses of steam. He was firing a weapon that was literally melting in his hands. The manual said this was impossible. The manual said the gun would seize, that the bolt would freeze, that the barrel would warp so badly the weapon would be unusable. But the gun kept working. It kept cycling. It kept firing, driven by nothing more than the force of will of the man refusing to let it quit. Inside the barrel, something catastrophic was happening. The rifling, those spiral grooves cut into the steel that grabbed the bullet and make it spin, were being destroyed. The extreme heat was causing the steel to lose its structural integrity. The grooves were melting, being worn away by the friction and heat until they were smooth. The barrel was becoming a smooth bore tube, like a musket from the Revolutionary War. And that changed everything about how the bullets flew. A spinning bullet is stable. It cuts through the air like a football thrown by a quarterback. Nose first. Aerodynamic, predictable. But when the rifling disappeared, the bullets stopped spinning. They started to tumble, to flip end over end like bricks thrown out of a moving car. They wobbled through the air, unstable and chaotic. At long range, a tumbling bullet is useless. It flies off in random directions. Accuracy disappears. But at the knife-fighting distances of the Guadalcanal jungle, at ranges measured in yards instead of hundreds of yards, a tumbling bullet becomes something monstrous. When a spinning bullet hits a human body, it drills a relatively clean hole. The wound channel is the diameter of the bullet, maybe slightly larger from cavitation effects. Ugly, but surgical. When a tumbling bullet hits a human body, it doesn't drill, it smashes. The bullet strikes sideways, presenting its full length to the tissue. Instead of a quarter-inch diameter impact, you get an impact the size of the entire bullet. The wound channel becomes massive, the size of a fist. The kinetic energy that would have been focused into a small point is spread across a larger area, creating catastrophic tissue damage. The Japanese soldiers charging Basiloni's position weren't just being shot, they were being torn apart by chunks of tumbling lead hitting them broadside. The entry wounds looked like they'd been made by explosives instead of bullets. The wounds had a distinctive keyhole shape when the bullet hit at an angle, wider at one end than the other. The gun was destroying itself, but in its death throes, it was inflicting more damage than it ever had when it was working perfectly. The irony wasn't lost on Basiloni. The experts had built a perfect machine, but the broken version was deadlier. He was fighting the weapon now as much as he was fighting the enemy. The heat from the receiver was intense enough to cook meat. His hands were turning black from carbon red, from burns, white from blisters. He could smell his own flesh cooking against the metal. Every time he touched the gun, it burned him. But the adrenaline flooding his system acted like anesthesia. The pain was there, but it was distant, muffled. His conscious mind had shut down. The reptilian brain had taken over. Feed the gun, kill the enemy, survive. The bodies in front of the position were piling up. This is something they don't show you in movies. In a real human wave attack, the dead don't disappear. They stack up. They create obstacles. The Japanese were pressing forward with such fanatical intensity that the corpses were forming a physical wall. The mound grew 2 feet high, then 3. It began to block Basiloni's line of fire. He couldn't shoot the men in the back of the wave because the men in the front were already dead and in the way. He had to stand up. Had to expose his upper body above the rim of the foxhole just to get the muzzle of the gun over the rampart of corpses. He was firing down into the next wave. The tracers sparked off the helmets of the fallen, ricocheting wildly into the jungle canopy. It was a landscape built entirely of mud and death. In the chaos and the darkness and the endless stream of violence, something happened that would stay with John Basiloni for the rest of his life. A Japanese soldier fell at the edge of the corpse wall, not immediately dead, wounded, unable to move. In the flickering light of a flare, Basiloni saw the man's hand reach into his tunic, pull out a small photograph. The photograph fluttered to the ground, face up. Even from 10 feet away, even in the terrible light, Basiloni could see what it was. A family, a woman, 2 small children, the same kind of photograph that Private Powell carried of his farm in Iowa. The wounded soldier looked at the photograph, then looked up at Basiloni. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. The Japanese soldier wasn't screaming anymore, wasn't charging, just a man, somebody's husband, somebody's father, about to die in the mud on an island whose name he probably couldn't pronounce. Then the next wave of attackers trampled over him and the moment was gone. The photograph disappeared under boots and blood. Basiloni kept firing because he had to, because if he stopped, everyone on this ridge would die. But somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place the adrenaline couldn't completely shut down, he filed that moment away, the photograph, the eyes. He understood then what the experts in their clean offices would never understand. This wasn't about good versus evil. It wasn't about freedom versus tyranny. Not at this level. At this level, it was just men killing men because other men in distant capitals had made decisions that led to this specific ridge on this specific night. But understanding didn't change what had to be done. The gun kept firing. The bodies kept piling up. The ammunition belt ran dry again. The click of the firing pin hitting empty air. The silence rushed in like a physical force, and the Japanese heard it. A renewed scream went up from the darkness. Banzai. They knew the dragon had stopped breathing fire. They surged forward, clambering over the wall of their own dead. 5 yards away, 3 yards. Bayonets catching the light from the flares. Basiloni didn't have time to reload, didn't have time to send for more ammunition. The gun was done. The machine had given everything it had. Now it was time for the man to finish what the machine had started. He dropped the glowing, ruined weapon. He grabbed his machete in one hand, his Colt 45 in the other, and he stepped out of the foxhole to meet them in the open. This wasn't a firefight anymore. It was a brawl. A Japanese officer came at John Basiloni out of the darkness swinging a katana, not a mass-produced military sword. A real katana, folded steel that had been in his family for generations, the kind of blade that could shear through a rifle barrel if the angle was right. The sword came down in an arc, designed to split Basiloni from shoulder to hip. But Basilone had learned to box in Manila. He'd learned that the man who moves first loses. You wait, you watch, you step inside the swing. He moved toward the officer instead of away. The blade whooshed past his ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air, close enough that it would have killed him if he'd been a half-second slower or a half-inch to the left. He jammed the muzzle of his Colt 45 into the officer's stomach and pulled the trigger. The heavy 45 caliber slug, traveling at 800 feet per second, hit the officer's abdomen and stopped his forward momentum like he'd run into a wall. The kinetic energy had nowhere to go except through his body. He flew backward into the mud, the sword clattering away into the darkness. Another soldier lunged with a bayonet. The blade caught the light from a flare overhead. Basilone parried it with the machete. Metal rang against metal with a sound that cut through the chaos. He swung back with a backhand blow. The machete wasn't a precision instrument. It was a heavy blade designed to hack through thick vegetation. It did the same thing to human bone. This was ugly work. The kind of fighting that happens when all the technology fails and all the tactics break down and what's left is two groups of men trying to kill each other with sharp objects in the mud. There was punching, kicking, stabbing, wrestling, slipping on ground made slick with rain and blood, fighting for inches. For a few minutes, John Basilone held the center of the line with nothing but hand weapons and determination. But he knew he couldn't hold them off forever with a pistol that held 7 rounds and a machete that was already notched and bent from hitting bone. He needed the machine gun. He needed the rhythm. He needed the mathematics of sustained fire. He kicked a Japanese soldier away, the man's face disappearing into the mud. Basilone dove back into the pit, his hands already burned and blistered, fumbled in the darkness at the bottom of the hole. His fingers searched desperately through the muck for anything that would feed the gun, a loose belt, a partial strip, anything with bullets in it. His hand closed around something, a fragment of an ammunition belt, maybe 20 rounds. It had been dropped in the chaos. Covered in mud and volcanic grit, he shook it as clean as he could, knowing even as he did it that the dirt would cause problems. But 20 dirty rounds were better than 0 clean rounds. He popped the top cover of the M1917. The metal hissed where his sweat dripped onto it. Hot enough to vaporize water on contact, he slammed the belt in despite the pain screaming from his hands. He racked the bolt with his boot, kicking it forward because his hands couldn't grip anymore. The gun fired. 20 rounds bought him 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds were enough. A few Marines from the rear echelon slid into the mud beside him. Cooks, clerks, runners, men who had grabbed rifles and decided that whatever job they'd been assigned didn't matter anymore because the line was breaking. They started throwing grenades over the wall of bodies. The explosions flashed white and orange, blowing gaps in the attacking force. Basilone used the respite to send one of the runners for more ammunition. He grabbed the young Marine by the front of his shirt. "Don't come back without it, you understand me? Don't come back without bullets." The kid scrambled away into the darkness. Basilone went back to the gun. He discovered that if he kicked the bolt forward with his boot, he could force it to close on the warped cartridges that the heat had deformed. The gun wasn't cycling smoothly anymore. The internal mechanisms were damaged from the extreme temperatures, but it would still fire if you beat it into submission. He was physically assaulting the weapon to keep it killing, kicking it, hitting it, forcing it to work through methods that would have horrified the engineers who designed it. Time lost all meaning. The concept of minutes and hours dissolved into one long continuous scream of violence. It could have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. It all felt the same. Load, fire, kick the bolt, fire again, duck the grenades, fire. The barrel continued to glow. Cherry red now, so hot that the steel was beginning to soften. Gravity started to pull the unsupported muzzle downward, creating a droop that the engineers would have said made the weapon inaccurate and dangerous. But the droop created an accidental advantage. It forced the bullets to impact the ground 10 feet in front of the gun instead of traveling parallel to the earth. The rounds hit the volcanic rock and shattered. They skipped up into the enemy like stones skipping on water. The fragments created a shotgun effect, shrapnel of lead and stone tearing into legs and lower bodies. The gun wasn't a precision instrument anymore. It was a bludgeon, a crude weapon that spewed hot metal in the general direction of the enemy and relied on volume of fire to compensate for accuracy. Around 4 in the morning, the attacks began to change. The organized waves stopped. The coordinated charges fell apart. What replaced them were sporadic, desperate rushes by small groups of men who knew they were already dead. They weren't trying to take the airfield anymore. They were trying to die with honor, trying to take at least one American with them. The Sendai Division was breaking. They had thrown their best men at this position, at this one muddy hole with one stubborn sergeant and one obsolete gun, and the position had held. The human wave had crashed against the immovable object and shattered into foam. Basilone was sitting in a pile of spent brass casings that came up to his waist. The amount of ammunition he'd fired was staggering, thousands of rounds. The empty shells had piled so high he had to dig his feet down through them to find purchase on the mud below. The condensation can that was supposed to recycle the steam had been shot to pieces hours ago. The rubber hose was shredded, the water jacket was dented and pierced in a dozen places by bullets and shrapnel. The gun was a wreck, but it was still firing. During a brief lull, Basiloni looked down at his hands in the flickering light of a flare. They didn't look like hands anymore. They looked like foreign objects, black with carbon from the powder, red with blood. Covered in blisters that had popped and filled with mud, the skin had cooked against the hot metal and then torn away when he'd moved his grip. He couldn't straighten his fingers. They were clawed into the shape of the pistol grip, the muscles locked in spasm. He realized he probably wouldn't be able to hold a fork or button a shirt for weeks, maybe months, but another shadow moved in the wire. He racked the bolt again. The sound was sluggish, a metal-on-metal grind like a car engine running without oil. The gun fired, the shadow fell. The psychological impact on the Japanese survivors was absolute. They had been told that Americans were soft, that they would break when faced with the warrior spirit, that the Marines would run when confronted with soldiers willing to die. Instead, they had run into a demon, a man who stood in the open and hugged a burning piece of steel and refused to die no matter how many of them charged. The bonsai spirit had met American stubbornness, and the bonsai had blinked. The noise of the battle began to fade. The screams of the wounded replaced the screams of the attacking. The hiss of rain hitting hot metal replaced the roar of gunfire. The darkness to the east began to turn a bruised purple. Dawn was coming. Basiloni leaned his forehead against the backplate of the gun. He was shaking uncontrollably now. The adrenaline that had kept him functional for the last 7 hours was draining out of his system like water from a broken pipe. The crash hit him like a physical blow. He tried to let go of the handles. His hands wouldn't open. The skin had literally fused to the parkerized steel in several places. The heat had melted the top layer of skin, and when it cooled, it had bonded to the metal. He had to peel himself off the weapon, tearing away skin that had become part of the gun. He looked at the barrel. It was white, flaky. The metal had oxidized and degraded. The rifling was completely gone. The water jacket was a ruin of dents and holes. It would never fire again. It was scrap metal, junk that would be thrown in a parts bin and forgotten. But as the first gray light of dawn started to filter through the trees, revealing the full scope of the carnage in front of his position, Basiloni knew it was the most beautiful piece of junk he had ever seen. The line had held. Henderson Field was safe, and the experts who said the gun was too heavy, too slow, too obsolete to save a mobile defense were about to wake up to a world where they were wrong. The sun that rose over Guadalcanal on the morning of October 25th, 1942, didn't look like a symbol of hope. It looked like a spotlight turning on in a slaughterhouse. The rain had finally stopped. The air was thick with steam rising from the hot ground. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and sickening, the smell of death on an industrial scale. The silence on the ridge was absolute. Not the peaceful silence of a morning in the country, the stunned, ringing silence that follows a catastrophe, like the moment after a car crash when your ears are still recovering from the impact. Sergeant John Basiloni sat in the mud at the bottom of his foxhole, staring at his boots. His hands were wrapped in dirty rags, throbbing with a pulse that felt like someone hitting his fingertips with a hammer. He was covered in a layer of black carbon oil and blood that had baked into his skin like a second hide. He looked less like a human being and more like a statue carved from volcanic ash. Private Powell was alive, curled in the corner of the foxhole, shaking, not from fear anymore, from exhaustion, from the realization that he'd survived something that should have killed him. Corporal Mitchell sat with his back against the mudbank, staring at nothing. His hands, which had been so steady during the fight, were trembling now. Sarge Powell said quietly. His voice was hoarse from screaming. "We made it." Basiloni looked at the kid, at the photograph of the Iowa farm that was still tucked in Powell's shirt pocket. "Yeah," he said, "we made it. You're going home, kid. Back to that farm. You earned it." When the officers from the rear finally made their way up the slippery ridge to inspect the defensive positions, they stopped walking about 20 yards from Basiloni's foxhole. They stopped because they couldn't go any further. The ground was impassable. It wasn't blocked by wire or fallen trees or destroyed equipment. It was blocked by the Sendai Division. The bodies of Japanese soldiers were piled 3 and 4 deep, stacked like cordwood in a gruesome rampart that stretched for nearly 100 yards. You couldn't walk through. You had to walk around, and walking around took time because the wall of the dead was so extensive. The officers stood there with their mouths open. These were men who had attended the military academies, who had studied tactics and strategy, who had written papers on the evolution of infantry weapons. They had all agreed that the water-cooled M1917 was a defensive relic, a tool for static warfare that couldn't stop a mobile assault. They were looking at physical evidence that contradicted every conclusion they'd ever reached. A single man with a single machine gun had held back a division. The math they'd done in their clean offices with their slide rules was wrong. The doctrine they'd written was wrong. The future they'd predicted was wrong. The officers picked their way through the carnage, stepping over debris and shell casings. They found the machine gun. At first, they didn't recognize it. It didn't look like a weapon anymore. It looked like something that had been pulled from a house fire. The barrel jacket that had started the night as a smooth green steel cylinder was now a warped, blackened husk. The paint had blistered and peeled away in large chunks. The metal underneath had oxidized to a chalky white. The receiver group was jammed, solid parts fused together by heat and lack of lubrication. It was a dead piece of iron, an inert lump, but around it, the story of the night was written in brass. The floor of the foxhole was carpeted in thousands of empty shell casings. They were piled so high they spilled over the lip of the hole and cascaded down the hillside like a metallic waterfall. And it wasn't just in one location. The officers found piles of brass at the primary gun position, piles at the secondary position where Basiloni had carried the gun during the crisis, piles at the fallback position. They realized he hadn't just fired the gun. He had moved a 90-pound weapon around the battlefield like it was a rifle. He had fought a mobile war with a static weapon. The vindication was complete, total, undeniable. The plumber's nightmare had worked, not because the manual was right. Because the man operating it had ignored the manual completely. He had treated the gun like a consumable resource, something you use up and throw away. He had spent the life of the machine to buy the lives of his platoon. The medics arrived to examine Basiloni's hands. When they peeled the rags away, they found second and third degree burns across his palms and the insides of his forearms. The skin was raw, angry, weeping, clear fluid. In some places, the burns went deep enough to expose tissue underneath. He had literally cooked his own flesh against the steel jacket to keep the gun steady. It was a handshake with hell that had saved the line. The medics told him he would be out of action for weeks, possibly months, depending on how the burns healed and whether infection set in. Basiloni looked at the destroyed gun and asked if they had any spare barrels. The Marine Corps didn't let him fade into obscurity. They realized immediately that they had a legend on their hands. A story too perfect to waste. They pulled him off the line, sent him to the rear, cleaned him up, and put him in front of generals who pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest. It was the highest award the country could give. Recognition that what he'd done went beyond duty, beyond the call of service. He had performed an act of such extraordinary heroism that it had to be acknowledged at the highest level. But then they did something that John Basiloni hated more than the Japanese army. They turned him into a celebrity. They sent him back to the United States to sell war bonds, to be paraded around at rallies and dinners and public events. They put him in a clean dress uniform with the Medal of Honor ribbon on his chest. They polished his shoes until they gleamed. They sent him to ballrooms in New York and Boston and Los Angeles where people in expensive clothes applauded and took photographs. They wanted him to smile and wave and shake hands, to tell sanitized stories about courage and sacrifice that made the war sound noble instead of ugly, to reassure the folks back home that their boys were winning, that everything was going to be fine. The Bond Tour started in September 1943. Basiloni's first major appearance was at Madison Square Garden in New York. 20,000 people packed into the arena, American flags hanging from the rafters, a full orchestra playing patriotic songs, searchlights sweeping across the crowd. Basiloni stood on a stage under blazing spotlights. The heat reminded him of the gun barrel. The roar of the crowd reminded him of the banzai charges. But everything else was wrong. The people were cheering, smiling, waving little flags like this was a parade instead of a war. A politician in an expensive suit stood at the microphone. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the hero of Guadalcanal, the man who single-handedly held off 3,000 Japanese soldiers, Gunnery Sergeant John Basiloni. The crowd erupted, 20,000 people on their feet, screaming, applauding. The sound washed over Basiloni like a physical wave. He stepped to the microphone, his hands still bandaged, gripped the sides of the podium. The politician leaned in, speaking into Basiloni's ear, but loud enough for the microphones to catch. Tell them about the heroism, Sergeant. Tell them how you saved Henderson Field. Basiloni looked out at the crowd, saw faces shining with excitement, saw women crying, saw men saluting. In the third row, he saw a group of women wearing gold star pins, mothers who had lost sons in the war. One of them was looking directly at him. She wasn't smiling, her eyes were hollow. She'd come here hoping to understand, hoping to find meaning in her son's death. And the Marine Corps had sent John Basiloni to give her that meaning in a neat package wrapped in a flag. He spoke into the microphone. There was no heroism, he said, just survival. The crowd went quiet, confused. The politician's smile froze. Basiloni continued, the men who didn't come home, They're the heroes, the ones still fighting. They're the heroes. I'm just the one who got lucky. That wasn't what they wanted to hear. The speech was supposed to inspire people to buy bonds, to feel good about the war effort. Basilone had just told them the truth instead. The politicians salvaged the event. They thanked Basilone profusely, ushered him off stage, brought up a Hollywood actress to sing the national anthem. The crowd forgot about the awkward moment and went back to cheering. Backstage, a Marine Corps public affairs officer pulled Basilone aside. "Sergeant, you need to understand what we're doing here. These bonds fund the war. They buy planes and ships and ammunition for the boys still fighting. You need to give them hope, not reality." Basilone nodded, but he knew he couldn't do this. Not for months, not for however long they wanted to keep him stateside. That night, back in his hotel room, Basilone found a letter that had been forwarded from Guadalcanal. The handwriting was shaky, the paper stained with what might have been blood or mud or both. He opened it. "Sarge, it's Mitchell. Made it off the canal, finally. They shipped us to New Caledonia for refit. Powell's with me. Kid's doing okay. Talks about his farm all the time. Says when he gets home, he's naming his first son after you. We heard they gave you the medal. You earned it. But we also heard they're keeping you stateside. Sarge, I know it's not my place, but we need you here, not there. These new guys don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the guns like you do. I know you're probably drinking coffee right now instead of rainwater, sleeping in a real bed instead of mud. But if you can find a way back, we'd be grateful. Still your spotter, Mitchell." Basilone read the letter 3 times, then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, next to the photograph of Powell's farm that the kid had given him before he left. "Take care of this for me, Sarge," Powell had said. "When you get home, mail it back so I know you made it." But Basilone wasn't home. He was in a hotel room in New York, wearing a clean uniform that felt like a costume, getting ready to do another show tomorrow in Philadelphia, then Boston, then Chicago, an endless parade of stages and spotlights and people who wanted him to be a symbol instead of a man. He walked to the window, looked out at the city, lights everywhere, people walking on safe streets, cars honking, life continuing as if there wasn't a war happening on the other side of the world. He thought about the ridge, about the smell of cordite and blood, about the weight of the gun in his hands, about the moment when the Japanese soldier's photograph had fallen in the mud, about Mitchell and Powell and all the Marines still out there. He thought about the experts who'd been wrong about the gun, and he realized that the politicians were wrong too. They thought they could keep him here, use him as a recruiting poster, a symbol of victory to inspire the home front. But John Basilone had never been good at being what other people wanted him to be. The next morning, he went to Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. He requested a meeting with the personnel office. They made him wait 3 hours. When he finally got in, a colonel sat behind a polished desk looking at Basilone's file. "Sergeant Basilone," the colonel said, "you're doing important work. The bond tours have raised over $1 million. That's ammunition, that's equipment, that's support for the men overseas. I want to go back," Basilone said. The colonel smiled. "I understand. Many men feel that way, but you've done your part. You've earned the right to serve out the war in safety. With respect, sir, I didn't earn anything. I got lucky one night. There are better Marines than me still fighting." The colonel's smile faded. "Sergeant, that's not how the Marine Corps sees it. You're more valuable here than you would be in combat. Then the Marine Corps is wrong, sir." The colonel stood up. "The meeting's over, Sergeant. You have a bond rally in Philadelphia tomorrow. Don't be late." Basilone left the office, but he didn't give up. He started writing letters to commanders, to generals, to anyone who would listen. He made himself a nuisance, showed up at offices unannounced, refused to cooperate with the bond tour schedule. The breaking point came in April 1944. Basilone was supposed to appear at a war bond rally in Hollywood. There was talk of a movie deal, of having him portrayed in a film about Guadalcanal. He didn't show up. Instead, he went back to Marine Corps headquarters. A general finally agreed to see him, not because he wanted to, because Basilone had become enough of a problem that ignoring him was harder than dealing with him. The general was blunt. "Basilone, you're throwing away a safe life. You could sit out the war in comfort, get married, start a family, be alive when this is all over." Basilone met his eyes. "I never wanted a safe life, sir. I wanted a true one. You understand that if we send you back, the odds are you won't survive. The Pacific is getting worse, not better." "I understand, sir." "Then you're a fool," maybe Basilone said. "But I'm a fool who knows where he belongs, and it's not on a stage in Hollywood." The general studied him for a long moment, then he picked up a pen and signed a transfer order. "You're going back to the Fleet Marine Force. Don't make me regret this," Basilone saluted. "Thank you, sir." As he turned to leave, the general spoke again. "Basilone, why, really? Why go back?" Basilone thought about Mitchell's letter, about Powell's photograph, about the men who were still out there fighting while he was eating steak dinners and signing autographs. "Because they're still there, sir. And while they're there, so am I." In July 1944, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone shipped out to the Pacific, not to Guadalcanal. That campaign was over. The island was secure. Now the war had moved north, toward Japan itself. He was assigned to the 5th Marine Division. They were training for an invasion. The target was classified, but everyone knew it would be big. bigger than Guadalcanal, bigger than anything they'd done before. Basiloni threw himself into training the new Marines, teaching them about machine guns, about fire discipline, about the difference between what the manual says and what works in combat. He met a woman, a Marine sergeant named Lena Riggi. She worked in the motor pool. She didn't care about the Medal of Honor or the Bond tours. She just knew him as John, the guy who was good with engines and told terrible jokes. They got married in July. They had 10 days together before Basiloni shipped out. The night before he left, Lena asked him why he'd come back. Everyone said you were safe, you could have stayed home. Basiloni thought about how to explain it. About duty and loyalty and the men who didn't have a choice. I belong with them, he finally said. With the Marines who are still fighting. That's where I've always belonged. You know you might not come back. I know. She kissed him, then come back anyway. In February 1945, Gunnery Sergeant John Basiloni landed on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. The war had changed since Guadalcanal. The weapons were newer, the tactics more sophisticated. The enemy was dug into a network of caves and tunnels instead of charging across open ground. But the job was the same. Take ground, hold ground, move forward. He wasn't carrying a water-cooled M1917 this time. He was carrying one of the newer air-cooled guns the experts had promised would replace the dinosaur. Lighter, more mobile, better suited to modern war. But the spirit was the same. John Basiloni led his machine gun section off the landing craft and into the heaviest fire of the Pacific campaign. He was aggressive, loud, visible. He moved toward the enemy instead of away. He guided a tank through a minefield, running ahead of it to mark safe paths while bullets kicked up sand around his boots. He destroyed pillboxes with grenades and rifle fire. He did the work of 10 men. The Marines with him thought he was invincible. Manila John, who'd survived Guadalcanal, who'd held the ridge alone, who'd come back from safety to fight alongside them. Nothing could kill him. They were wrong. A Japanese mortar round landed in the middle of his section. The explosion killed John Basiloni instantly. There were no last words, no dramatic final scene, no heroic speech, just sudden violence, the way warriors actually die. His body was found in a shell crater, still moving forward, still leading from the front. He had died the way he'd lived, refusing to quit, refusing to accept limits. When the news reached the United States, people were shocked. The Bond tour hero, the man with the Medal of Honor, the face they'd seen in all the photographs and newsreels, gone. But to the Marines who knew him, who'd served with him, it made perfect sense. John Basiloni was never going to die in a bed. He was never going to retire to a quiet house and spend his days telling stories to grandchildren about what it was like. He was forged in the fire and meant to die in it. His legacy wasn't the medal. It wasn't the statues they built in his hometown of Raritan. It wasn't the ships they named after him or the books written about that night on Guadalcanal. His legacy was the lesson he taught the Marine Corps. That technology is always secondary to will. That a weapon is only obsolete if you lack the courage to use it, that you can take a heavy, clumsy, broken piece of junk and turn it into the hammer of God if you're willing to pay the price in pain. The M1917 was eventually retired, replaced by the M60 and later the M240, lighter guns with quick change barrels and modern ergonomics. The days of water jackets and condensation hoses are gone. You won't see a plumber's nightmare on a modern battlefield. But if you look closely at how the Marine Corps trains its machine gunners, you'll see the ghost of John Basiloni. When they teach a young Marine to clear a jam in 3 seconds, they're teaching him the Basiloni way. When they teach him to maintain his sector, even when the world is ending, they're channeling the spirit of that ridge. When they teach him that the mission matters more than the manual, they're passing down a truth that was written in blood and steel on October 24th, 1942. The experts eventually admitted they'd been wrong, not publicly, not in any official document, but in the quiet conversations between officers, in the lessons learned reports that circulated after Guadalcanal, the truth emerged. The weapon hadn't failed, the doctrine had failed. They'd built a perfect machine and then written rules that prevented it from being used to its full potential. It took a truck driver from New Jersey to show them what the gun could really do when you stopped treating it like a delicate instrument and started treating it like a weapon of war. When you stopped caring about preserving the machine and started caring about winning the fight. Don't remember John Basiloni as a photograph, not as a black and white image of a young man in a uniform smiling at a camera, not as a name on a ship or a statue in a park. Remember the mud, remember the smell of burning skin, remember the steam rising from a glowing barrel in the rain. Remember the moment when a man looked at a failing machine and decided to become the machine himself. Remember the trade he made, his hands for their lives, the gun's future for the platoon's survival, his safety for their chance to go home. Remember that wars aren't won by the weapons with the best specifications on paper. They're won by the people who refuse to let go of the trigger, by the ones who understand that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep fighting when every rational calculation says you should quit. John Basiloni held that trigger until the barrel melted, until his hands cooked, until the physics said the gun couldn't possibly keep working, and then he held it a little longer because the math said one man couldn't stop 3,000 soldiers, and John Basilone decided to prove the math wrong. The only thing that stops a Marine machine gunner is the end of the belt or the end of his life. Manila John Basilone proved which one comes first every single time.